It was the kind of scandal that could shatter a family's reputation and change the course of history. In the early 16th century, Mary Boleyn, a young and beautiful English noblewoman, found herself at the heart of a rumor that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The whisper was that she had been the mistress of not just one, but two of the most powerful men in Europe, King François I of France and King Henry VIII of England. Mary's story begins in the opulent and dangerous courts of France, where she served as a maid of honor to the English Queen Mary Tudor. The French court was a place of beauty and intrigue, where the line between pleasure and scandal was often blurred. Mary, with her Rubens-like coloring and gentle demeanor, was a striking figure. But it was her reputation that set her apart, and not in a good way. The first hint of trouble came in 1514, when Mary was just a teenager. She was part of the entourage that accompanied Queen Mary Tudor to France, where the young English queen was to marry the elderly King Louis XII. The marriage was a political alliance, and Mary Boleyn was one of the many young ladies sent to serve the new queen. But it wasn't long before Mary's own life took a dramatic turn. In the luxurious Hôtel de Cluny, where the English court stayed, Mary found herself caught in the gaze of the charming and powerful François, the newly crowned King of France. François was known for his many mistresses, and his insatiable appetite for pleasure. For Mary, a young and inexperienced girl, the king's attention was both thrilling and terrifying. She was torn between her duty to the queen and her own desires. The affair, if it happened, was likely brief and secret. It would have been difficult to keep such a liaison hidden, but the court was a place of many secrets. Some historians believe that the affair lasted only a few months, while others suggest it was a single night of passion. Whatever the truth, the consequences were far-reaching. Mary's family, the Boleyns, were ambitious and well-connected. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a diplomat and a man of great ambition. He had high hopes for his daughters, Mary and her younger sister, Anne. For a girl of gentle birth to lose her virtue to the King of France was a disaster. It was a scandal that could ruin the family's reputation and their chances for advancement. The news of Mary's indiscretion eventually reached her family. It is likely that Queen Mary Tudor, who was responsible for the conduct of her ladies, discovered the affair and reported it to Sir Thomas. The Boleyns were horrified. Mary's actions had not only compromised her own future, but also the family's standing in the eyes of the English court. Sir Thomas was faced with a difficult decision. He could not allow Mary to remain in France, where her presence was a constant reminder of her shame. He recalled her to England, where she would be kept out of sight and out of mind. Mary's younger sister, Anne, who was known for her wit and charm, was sent to the French court instead. Anne would go on to become a maid of honor to Queen Claude, a position of great prestige and one that Mary had once hoped to hold. Mary's return to England marked the beginning of a life filled with disappointment and shadows. She was no longer the favored daughter, and her family's disapproval was palpable. Anne, who had always been the more accomplished and clever of the two sisters, now shone even brighter in Mary's absence. The Boleyns, once united in their ambitions, were now divided by Mary's scandal, but Mary's story was far from over. Her brief affair with King François I would be just the beginning of a life marked by both love and scandal. As she returned to England, she had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same again. As the years passed, the story of the Boleyn sisters, Anne and Mary, became a tangle of myths and half-truths. Many people were confused about what happened to them during their time at the French court. Some said both girls stayed there, serving the new French queen, Claude, after Mary Tudor, the King of England's sister, returned home. Others claimed only Mary Boleyn found a place at the new queen's court. One writer even suggested that Anne joined her sister in 1517, and Mary came back to England with the English court after a grand event called the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. But these stories are full of holes and lack evidence. One common myth is that Anne went to France with her father in 1519. Another is that her father quickly recalled Mary from France after Mary Tudor returned to England, thinking Mary had disgraced the family. Some say Anne was only a frequent visitor at the French court, or that her father placed her in Queen Catherine's entourage around 1519. None of these claims have any real proof. There's also no evidence that Mary came back to England with Mary Tudor in 1515, and then returned to France in 1518, where she stayed for 2 years and gained a bad reputation. The truth is, there is no mention in old records of Mary staying at the French court. On the other hand, it's clear that Anne did stay. Some say Anne blamed Mary Tudor for her sister Mary's wild behavior, which might explain why Anne and Mary Tudor didn't get along later when Anne became Henry VIII's queen. But this idea is just a guess, and isn't backed by any real sources. Anne probably stayed at the French court because of her talents and her father's influence. Being chosen to serve the virtuous Queen Claude was a big deal. Anne would have had to be very well-mannered and skilled to win such a prestigious position. She spent her formative years with about 300 other noble young women, living a life that was almost like being in a convent. They had to follow strict rules, pray often, and do good deeds. Most importantly, they had to keep their virtue. Queen Claude's life was tough. She was born with a limp but was often pregnant. Her husband, François I, was unfaithful, and her mother-in-law, Louise of Savoy, was very controlling. Because Claude felt out of place at the court, she often stayed at beautiful castles in the Loire Valley. When she did go to court, she watched her attendants closely to protect them from the many men who might try to take advantage of them. Anne's time at the French court is well documented. In 1536, Lancelot de Carles, who worked at the French embassy in London, wrote that Anne first went out of this country England when Mary Tudor left it to go and seek the King of France in 1514. He said that when Mary returned to England in 1515, Anne stayed on and became so graceful that people thought she was French. Another writer from the same time, called the Spanish Chronicle, also said Anne was raised at the French court. In 1583, Charles de Burgeville wrote that Anne was brought up in France, after going there when King Louis XII married Mary Tudor. William Camden said Anne was a maid of honor to Queen Claude, and later to François' sister, Marguerite of Valois. Lord Herbert wrote that Anne lived some time in France, whither, in the train of the Queen of France, she went AD 1514. After the death of Louis XII, she did not return with the Dowager, but was received into a place of much honor with the other Queen Claude, and then with Marguerite, Duchess of Alencon, with whom she remained till some difference grew betwixt our king and François in 1522. François I himself complained in 1522 that the popular daughter of Mr. Boleyn had been called back to England. This couldn't have been Mary, as she was already married in England in 1520. George Cavendish, who worked for Cardinal Wolsey, said Anne was sent to France to serve the French queen and stayed until the queen died. He was actually talking about Queen Claude, who died in 1524, but he got the timing wrong. Still, he knew Anne served Claude while in France. All this evidence shows that it was Anne Boleyn, and not Mary Boleyn, who stayed at the French court and spent several years there. But what about Mary? There's no record of her being at the French court between 1515 and 1520. So where was she? For 5 years after Mary might have returned to England, there's no mention of her. Some say she stayed at the English court, but there's no proof of this. Others claim she became one of Queen Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, but again, there's no evidence. There's also no record of a darkening cloud of scandal and gossip following her return, which might have kept her from serving the virtuous Queen Catherine. Mary Tudor, who was known as the French Queen in England, kept a household that matched her status. She had at least one of the girls who served her in France, Anne Jerningham, who married Sir Edward Grey. Lady Grey was still with Mary Tudor in 1517, when Queen Catherine visited. Some of the other girls who served Mary Tudor in France, like Lady Elizabeth Grey and Mary Fiennes, stayed on to serve Queen Claude. Jane Berchier married Edmund Knivet soon after returning to England, and there's no record of her being in Mary Tudor's household. So it seems that Mary Boleyn was not in the service of Queen Claude, Catherine of Aragon, or Mary Tudor during this time. It's possible that Mary was dismissed from Mary Tudor's service when her mistress returned to England, perhaps because of her misconduct. Mary Tudor, who had just extricated herself from a scandal involving her secret marriage, wouldn't have wanted a girl with a questionable reputation in her household. Mary Boleyn's sin of fornication was more serious than Mary Tudor's, and it wouldn't have been condoned. Despite this, Mary Tudor remained friendly with the Boleyn family. In 1517, when Mary Tudor's daughter Frances was christened, Anne Tempest, the wife of Mary Boleyn's uncle, stood as godmother. This suggests that the dismissal of Mary Boleyn from Mary Tudor's service was handled discreetly and amicably. If Mary wasn't serving any of these queens, where was she? She might have returned to Hever Castle to wait for a marriage her father would arrange. But there's another possibility, one that comes from her being confused with her sister in some old accounts. Lord Herbert wrote that Anne Boleyn, when she was 15, was caught in a compromising situation with one of her father's servants and was sent to France in disgrace. Another writer, Nicholas Sander, said Anne had affairs with her father's butler and chaplain and was then sent to France, where she was called a hackney and a mule. A hackney was a prostitute, and a mule suggested she couldn't have children. Sander said Anne was sent to a place called Brie, where she lived with a nobleman before going to the French court. These stories don't fit with what we know about Anne. She was probably 15 in 1516, when she was already serving Queen Claude. Sander's account has a 4-month gap in Anne's life, but she went straight from Brussels to the French court. If Anne had been so promiscuous, it would have been mentioned by her enemies when Henry VIII was trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne. Sander and Rassel were trying to discredit Anne Boleyn and her family. Sander often reported rumors as facts, and even made things up. He might have heard gossip about Mary Boleyn and François I, and mistakenly thought it was about Anne. He might have assumed that no woman left the French court chaste, and added some colorful details. Many historians have associated these stories with Mary Boleyn, thinking she was the one called the hackney, or mule. But these accounts were likely meant to smear Anne. Sander and Rassel were not reliable sources, and their stories about Anne are full of errors. If Mary Boleyn did have a bad reputation, it's possible that Sander and Rassel confused her with Anne. Sander's mention of Brie might be true, and could relate to Mary being sent there to stay with a nobleman after her reputation was damaged at the French court. But there's no solid evidence that Thomas Boleyn caught Mary in a compromising situation with a servant. If he had, he probably wouldn't have sent her to France with Mary Tudor. So, while the story of the Boleyn sisters is full of myths and confusion, the evidence suggests that Anne Boleyn spent several years at the French court, serving 3 queens. Mary Boleyn's fate during this time is less clear, but it seems she was not at the French court and might have been sent to Brie to stay with a nobleman after her reputation was tarnished. Mary Boleyn's life was a tapestry of intrigue, mystery, and unexpected twists. One of the most fascinating aspects of her story is the possibility that she spent part of her youth in France, specifically in Brie-sous-Forges, a small town southeast of Paris. This connection to France adds a layer of complexity to her background and sheds light on her early life. In 1654, Jean Brodau, in his biography of the French jurist Charles Dumoulin, mentioned that Anne Boleyn was brought up in Brie-sous-Forges by a relative of Dumoulin. This relative was identified as Philippe Dumoulin, who was the seigneur of Brie and a cupbearer to King François. The first Philippe Dumoulin's wife, Marie de Boulogne, was said to be distantly related to the Boleyns. This connection suggests that Anne Boleyn might have spent part of her youth in Brie-sous-Forges, a place that now bears a street named after her and a tower called the Tour Anne Boleyn, dating back to around 1200. However, the story of Anne Boleyn in Brie-sous-Forges is not without its doubts. Some historians argue that it was actually Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, who lived there. This theory is supported by several factors. For instance, Philippe Dumoulin was known to Sir Thomas Boleyn, Mary and Anne's father, when Sir Thomas was serving as an ambassador to France. It's possible that Sir Thomas placed Mary, who was described as a child, with Philippe Dumoulin because of a scandal involving Mary and King François I. The idea is that Mary was sent to Brie to preserve her reputation and learn proper conduct in a respectable noble household. The confusion between Mary and Anne is understandable, especially since both sisters were part of the English court and had connections to France. The local tradition in Brie-sous-Forges that Anne lived there dates back to the 16th century, and it is documented by several early historians, including John Bale, Bishop Burnet, and David Hume. However, the evidence for Mary's presence in Brie is stronger, given the scandal surrounding her and King François I. Mary's marriage to William Carey in 1520 was another significant event in her life. William Carey was a member of the King's Privy Chamber and a cousin to Henry VIII. The marriage was not a hasty affair, as some have suggested, but a well-planned union that had the king's approval. The king himself attended the wedding, which took place on February 4, 1520, at the newly rebuilt Chapel Royal at Greenwich Palace. The king's book of payments records a 6 shilling and 8 pence offering at the altar during the ceremony. William Carey was far from an undistinguished courtier. He held a coveted position in the royal household and was highly favored by the king. The marriage was a good match for Mary, both in terms of age and social standing. It is likely that Sir Thomas Boleyn, Mary's father, approved of the union and saw it as a way to bolster the family's position at court. The presence of the king at the wedding underscores the importance of the match and the support it received from the royal court. Mary and William Carey were well matched, and their marriage was a significant step for the Boleyn family. It is possible that the marriage was arranged with the king's influence, given his traditional right to approve or arrange marriages among the nobility. The marriage also provided the Boleyns with a strategic advantage in their rivalry with Cardinal Wolsey, a powerful figure at court. The story of Mary Boleyn's early life and her marriage to William Carey is a complex one, filled with historical debates and conflicting theories. Whether she lived in Brie-sous-Forges or not, and whether her marriage was a strategic move or a love match, her life was undoubtedly shaped by the political and social dynamics of the Tudor court. Her story continues to fascinate historians and readers alike, offering a glimpse into the lives of women in a time of great change and intrigue. William Carey, the second son of Thomas Carey and Margaret Spencer, was born around 1496 in Chilton Foliat, a small village in Wiltshire. His family had a rich history dating back to the 11th century, with roots in Somerset and Devon. Despite his noble lineage, William had no land or title to inherit, so he had to make his own way in the world. His rise to prominence at the court of King Henry VIII was a testament to his abilities and charm. William began his career at court in January 1519, likely through the patronage of Henry Courtenay, Earl of Devon, who was the king's cousin. William quickly proved himself to be a reliable and talented young man, and by the end of that year, he had secured a position as an esquire of the body in the king's privy chamber. This was a prestigious role, and William's duties included attending to the king's personal needs, guarding his lodgings, and sharing his leisure time. Henry VIII was known for his love of sports, music, and merrymaking, and William fit right in. He was skilled at jousting, tennis, and gambling, and he had a sharp wit and a charming personality. These qualities made him a favorite at court, and he soon became one of the king's closest companions. In 1519, the king granted William an annuity of 50 marks, a significant sum that reflected his growing importance. William's position in the Privy Chamber also gave him access to the inner workings of the royal household. He was entitled to daily meals and a comfortable lodging, and he was allowed to keep 4 servants and 2 horses at court. He participated in royal revels and pageants, and he was often seen playing tennis with the king and other courtiers. His rapid rise to favor was a mark of the king's trust and admiration. In October 1519, William's name appeared on a list of 32 privileged persons who received daily meals in the king's household. This list included high-ranking officials and members of the royal family, and William's inclusion was a clear sign of his elevated status. He was also mentioned in a document from 1520, which recorded his role as an esquire of the body and his right to keep 4 servants and 2 horses at court. William's success at court was not without its challenges. The Privy Chamber was a center of power, and there were often clashes with the more traditional aristocracy. Some nobles, like the Duke of Buckingham, resented the king's favor toward younger, less noble courtiers like William. They called these young men minions, a term that meant favorites or darlings. Despite this, William remained in the king's good graces and survived the purges of 1519 and 1526, which saw many courtiers banished from court. William's rise to prominence also brought him closer to the Boleyn family. In 1520, he married Mary Boleyn, the sister of Anne Boleyn, who would later become Queen of England. Mary was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, and her marriage to William was a strategic move that strengthened the Boleyn family's position at court. William was a handsome and intelligent man, and he and Mary shared a comfortable and prestigious life at court. After their marriage, William and Mary likely lived at court, moving between the various royal palaces as the king required. They would have shared a lodging with 4 servants, and their rooms would have been small but comfortable. Court life was busy and demanding, with constant social events and royal duties, but it was also a place of luxury and privilege. William's position as an esquire of the body gave him and Mary access to the king's inner circle, and they became part of a close-knit group of courtiers who were the king's closest friends and advisors. This elite group was known for its wit, charm, and talent, and they often shared the king's interests in sports, music, and entertainment. Mary's life at court was not just about luxury. It also involved serving the queen and other ladies of the court. As the wife of a prominent courtier, she was sometimes called upon to serve as an extra lady in waiting to the queen. This role gave her status and an independent income, but it also meant that she was part of the king's social circle, which would later have significant consequences for her and her family. William's success and Mary's connections made them a well-respected couple at court. They were part of a world of power, influence, and intrigue, where every move and every word could have far-reaching consequences. Despite the challenges, William and Mary thrived in this environment, and their marriage marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Boleyn family's rise to prominence. The year 1520 was a whirlwind for Mary Boleyn. It began with her serving as one of the gentlewomen in Queen Catherine's entourage, a role that brought her into the heart of court life. But it was the grand event known as the Field of Cloth of Gold that truly marked the year. This lavish summit between King Henry VIII of England and King François, the first of France, was a spectacle of unmatched opulence and pageantry, and Mary was right in the middle of it. Mary, now known as Mistress Carey, was among the 25 gentlewomen who accompanied the Queen to France. The journey was a grand affair, with each lady allowed to bring a woman, 2 menservants, and 3 horses. The English court sailed from Dover in a fleet of ships, dressed in their finest clothes, ready to impress their French counterparts. When they arrived in Guines, a temporary palace of wood and canvas awaited them, adorned with the most luxurious fabrics and decorations. Mary's husband, William Carey, was also present, serving as one of the king's esquires for the body. The 2 kings met on June 7th, in a field ringed with sumptuous tents and pavilions. The air was thick with the scent of success, and the clash of metal as knights jousted and feasted. Mary watched as her husband competed in the tournaments, earning the acclaim of both courts. The days were filled with banquets, dancing, and entertainment, and the nights with fireworks that lit up the sky. Despite the grandeur, there were moments of tension. King Henry, ever the proud and competitive man, challenged King François to a wrestling match. The match ended with François throwing Henry to the ground, causing a brief but intense moment of diplomatic crisis. It was only the quick thinking of the 2 queens, Catherine and Claude, that prevented any further conflict. For Mary the Somme, it was a mix of excitement and anxiety. She had spent years in France and was familiar with the French court and its customs. She must have felt a sense of familiarity and perhaps some unease, wondering if anyone from her past would recognize her or if any old rumors would resurface. But she remained a loyal and attentive lady to the Queen, participating in the festivities and enjoying the grandeur of the event. After the summit, the court returned to England, and life at court continued. Mary and William settled into their roles, and William was later appointed keeper of the King's House of Beaulieu, a grand palace that had once belonged to Mary's family. This appointment was a sign of the king's trust and confidence in William, and it meant that Mary and William could enjoy some privacy and a respite from the constant demands of court life. But life was not without its sorrows. In 1520, the Boleyn family suffered a devastating loss when Thomas Boleyn the Younger, Mary's eldest brother, died. The cause of his death remains unknown, but his passing was a heavy blow to the family. Now George, Mary's younger brother, was the heir to the Boleyn estates. Despite this loss, Sir Thomas Boleyn continued to arrange marriages for his children. By the spring of 1520, he was negotiating a match for his younger daughter, Anne, to James Butler, the son of Sir Piers Butler. This further solidified the Boleyns' position at court and ensured that the family's future would remain bright. As the year drew to a close, Mary and William participated in more courtly events, including the jousts held to celebrate the marriage of the Earl of Devon. The king himself took part, and William Carey, now a prominent figure at court, joined in the festivities. For Mary, 1520 was a year of contrasts of grandeur and sorrow, of excitement and anxiety. But through it all, she remained a key figure at the heart of the English court, her life a testament to the complexities and challenges of being a woman in the Tudor era.